I still remember the sound of the front door closing behind them that morning. Not slammed, not rushed, just calm, confident, as if leaving me behind was the most natural thing in the world. My son had looked me straight in the eye and said there was no money for an extra ticket, that times were tight, that maybe next year would be better, and his wife stood beside him nodding, already distracted by her phone and the trip ahead. I smiled, told them to have a safe journey, and watched their car disappear down the street while something inside me quietly broke. The house felt different after that, heavier somehow, like it finally understood what I had been pretending not to see for years. While they were posting photos and sipping drinks, I walked through every room in silence, touching things I had paid for, built, fixed, and protected, realizing how much of my life had been reduced to something optional. That was when I made a decision I had avoided for far too long, not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I did not argue, I did not call, I did not warn them, I simply acted. By the time their vacation ended, everything they assumed would still be waiting was already gone, and so was the version of me they thought they could ignore. What happened next was not loud at first, but it would echo through their lives in ways they never expected. If you stay with me, you will see how betrayal turns into regret, how silence becomes power, and how the ending delivers a satisfaction they never saw coming. My name is Franklin Adler, though most people call me Frank. I'm 68 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 40 years building bridges and highways across 3 states. I lost my wife Eleanor 3 years ago to cancer, and since then, I've been living with my son Ethan and his wife Lauren in the house. I helped them buy a house I paid the down payment on, a house where I've slowly become a stranger. It happened on a Sunday evening in March, the kind of evening that starts ordinary and ends with your whole world tilted sideways. We were finishing dinner pot roast that I'd cooked, since Lauren doesn't like to waste her weekends in the kitchen. When Ethan cleared his throat in that particular way he does when he's about to deliver news he's already decided I won't like. "So, Dad," he said, not quite meeting my eyes, "Lauren and I have been planning a little getaway. 2 weeks in Hawaii. We leave next month." I felt my heart lift for a moment. Eleanor and I had always talked about Hawaii. We'd never made it there, always putting it off for someday, and then someday ran out. The thought of finally seeing those beaches, even without her, stirred something hopeful in my chest. "That sounds wonderful," I said. "I'll need to dig out my summer clothes. Haven't worn shorts since." "Actually, Dad," Ethan's voice had that rehearsed quality, like he'd practiced this in the mirror. "We looked at the budget, and we really couldn't fit another ticket in. You know how expensive everything is these days." Lauren looked up from her phone, where she'd been scrolling through what I now realized were resort photos. Her face arranged itself into an expression of sympathy so perfect it might have been painted on. "Frank, honestly, you wouldn't enjoy it anyway. The flights are so long, 14 hours with the layover, and all the activities are really geared toward younger people. Hiking, snorkeling, ziplining. You'd be so much more comfortable here at home." I opened my mouth to respond, but what could I say? That I'd paid for this house? That my savings had funded Ethan's college education, his wedding, the kitchen renovation Lauren insisted on last year? Every word of protest died in my throat because Lauren had done something clever. She'd made her exclusion sound like consideration. She'd wrapped cruelty in the language of care, and if I objected, I would seem difficult, needy, like the demanding old man she'd always implied I was. "Of course," I heard myself say. "You're probably right." They returned to their planning with visible relief, as if I'd passed some sort of test by not making a scene. I listened to them discuss snorkeling tours and luau's and sunset cruises, their voices bright with anticipation, and I understood something that settled into my bones like winter cold. They didn't hate me. They didn't resent me. That might have been easier to bear. No, the truth was simpler and far worse. I had become unnecessary, a piece of furniture they'd outgrown, something to be stored in the corner and occasionally dusted off for holidays. I excused myself to clear the dishes, a task that had somehow become exclusively mine over the past 3 years, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly when that happened. As I carried the plates to the kitchen, I passed the hallway closet, its door slightly ajar. Inside, on the top shelf, I glimpsed a small velvet box I'd never noticed before. A ring box, clearly old, with a jeweler's name I didn't recognize, embossed in faded gold. Not Eleanor's, not anything from our family. I paused, something cold flickering through my mind, but then Lauren's laughter rang out from the dining room, and I dismissed it. Probably costume jewelry, probably nothing. I stood at the sink, running water over the plates Eleanor had picked out 20 years ago, and I heard them. They didn't know I could hear, or maybe they didn't care. "He took that better than I expected," Ethan said, his voice low. And then Lauren, her whisper carrying clearly through the quiet house. "He'll be fine. He always is. That's what survivors do." I turned off the water. My hands were steady, which surprised me. Inside, something had shifted a tectonic plate, moving deep beneath the surface of who I thought I was, who I thought my son was, who I thought we were to each other. Eleanor had tried to warn me, in her gentle way, during those last months. I hadn't listened. I'd told myself that family was family, that blood meant something, that my son would never truly abandon me. Standing there in the kitchen of the house I'd paid for, listening to them plan a vacation I wasn't invited to, I finally understood what my wife had seen long before I did. And I understood that something was going to have to change. Sleep wouldn't come that night. I lay in my small bedroom at the back of the house, the room that used to be Ethan's childhood bedroom, before Lauren decided the master guest suite would make a better home office for her, and stared at the ceiling until the numbers on my clock blurred into meaninglessness. At 2 a.m, I gave up pretending and slipped out of bed. The filing cabinet in the corner had been with me for 30 years. Eleanor used to tease me about it, calling me her paper dragon, because I never threw anything away. Tax returns from 1,987, receipts for appliances long since replaced, the deed to our first apartment, the one with the leaky faucet, and the neighbor who played saxophone at midnight. I'd brought the cabinet here when I moved in after Eleanor's funeral, and it had sat untouched ever since. A relic of a life that no longer existed. I opened the top drawer and began to pull out folders. The numbers told a story I had never let myself read before. The down payment on this house, $62,000, drawn from the savings Eleanor and I had accumulated over decades of careful living. The kitchen renovation Lauren wanted 3 years ago, $41,000, charged to my credit card because Ethan's was maxed out from the wedding. Ethan's college loans paid off in 2015 by Eleanor and me, a graduation gift we'd presented with pride and received with a quick hug and quicker forgetting. The cars in the driveway, both financed through my credit union because my score was better. The country club membership, Lauren said, was essential for networking, $800 a month, automatically deducted from my checking account. Even the premium cable package, the one with all the movie channels Lauren watched while I read in my room, came out of an account with my name on it. My hands trembled as I flipped through page after page, but not from weakness, not from age. They trembled from seeing the pattern laid bare, from understanding that I had been the foundation of a house that had slowly, methodically, decided it no longer needed its foundation. Near the bottom of the second drawer, behind tax returns from 2019, my fingers brushed something unexpected. A manila envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges, with handwriting I would recognize anywhere. Eleanor's elegant script, the way she always curved her capital letters, spelling out words that made my heart clench in my chest. "For Frank, when you're ready." I held the envelope for a long moment before opening it. Whatever was inside, Eleanor had hidden it here, knowing I would find it eventually, knowing that someday I would be desperate enough or hurt enough to dig through these old papers. She had known me better than I knew myself, even at the end. Inside were documents I didn't fully understand, legal papers, with dense paragraphs and phrases like revocable trust and successor trustee. But clipped to the front was a handwritten note on Eleanor's personal stationery, the cream-colored paper with tiny roses in the corner that she'd used for important correspondence. "My dearest Frank," it read. "If you're reading this, then what I feared has finally happened. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from it. I'm sorry I couldn't make you see what I saw. But I did what I could while I still had time. Daniel has everything, all the paperwork, all the provisions, everything you'll need. I watched Lauren for 2 years before I acted. I watched how she positioned herself, how she isolated you from your friends, how she made herself indispensable while making you feel dispensable. I saw this coming, my love. Trust Daniel. He knows everything. And please, Frank, don't blame yourself for not seeing. You always believed the best in people. It's one of the things I loved most about you. But some people don't deserve your faith. I love you forever and always. Eleanor. I read the note 3 times, each reading uncovering another layer of meaning. Eleanor had watched Lauren. She had seen something in those early years, something I had dismissed as motherly overprotectiveness. I remembered now the way Eleanor would fall silent when Lauren spoke, her eyes tracking Lauren's movements with an attention I'd mistaken for interest. She hadn't been admiring our daughter-in-law. She had been studying her. Sitting there in the darkness, I let myself remember how it had happened, the creeping control, the slow erosion. It started so gently after Eleanor's death, when I was drowning in grief and grateful for any hand that reached out. "I'll handle the grocery shopping," Lauren had said. "You shouldn't have to worry about that right now." And I'd thanked her, relieved. "Let me manage the bills," she'd offered a month later. "I'm setting everything up digitally anyway. It's easier if it's all in one system." And I'd agreed, because what did I know about apps and automatic payments? "I'll coordinate the family schedule," she'd announced by summer's end. "It's simpler with one point of contact. You just relax and let me know if you need anything." And I'd nodded, because by then I was used to nodding, used to being managed, used to being handled. I hadn't lost control of my life. I understood that now with terrible clarity. I'd had it taken from me, one small kindness at a time, each theft disguised as a gift. At the very bottom of Eleanor's envelope, beneath the legal documents and the handwritten note, I found a business card. Simple white stock, professional black lettering, Daniel Cross, estate attorney. I turned it over. On the back, in Eleanor's handwriting, were words that must have broken her heart to write. "He knows everything. Call when Ethan chooses her over you." She had known. Even then, even years ago, Eleanor had known this day would come. She had prepared for it, planned for it, and waited hoping she was wrong, knowing she wasn't. I looked at that business card for a long time, watching the first gray light of dawn creep through my window. Then I tucked it carefully into my wallet, returned everything else to the filing cabinet, and began to wait for Monday morning. The morning they left for Hawaii arrived with the kind of bright, cheerful sunshine that felt like mockery. I stood in the foyer at 6:30, watching Lauren direct the loading of suitcases into the taxi with the efficiency of a general marshalling troops. 3 large bags for her, 2 for Ethan, a carry-on stuffed with beach reeds and sunscreen. 2 weeks of paradise, packed and ready. Lauren approached me last, her smile polished to a professional sheen. "Now, Frank, the alarm code is the same Ethan's birthday backwards. Garbage goes out Tuesday and Friday. There's leftover pasta in the fridge, and I've left the number for the lawn service on the counter in case they have questions." She spoke to me the way one might brief a house sitter, someone hired for a temporary job. Not the man who had lived here for 3 years. Not the man whose money had made this house possible in the first place. "I'll manage," I said. Ethan came next. He hugged me, and I felt the perfunctory nature of it in my bones, arms that touched but didn't hold, a pat on the back that lasted exactly 1 second, the kind of embrace you offer an acquaintance at a funeral when social convention demands some gesture but genuine feeling is absent. "Take care of yourself, Dad," he said, already turning toward the door. "Have a good trip," I replied to his retreating back. The door closed. The taxi pulled away. I stood in the foyer of the house I had paid for, surrounded by furniture I had helped select, beneath a roof I had put over their heads, and I felt like a ghost. Not dead, but not quite alive either, existing in a space that no longer acknowledged my presence, haunting rooms that had forgotten I mattered. The silence that followed was profound, not peaceful, eerie. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what I would do now that its real owners had departed. I walked through the rooms slowly, touching surfaces, opening cabinets, looking at everything with new eyes. The kitchen Lauren had redesigned. The living room where my old recliner had been replaced by a sectional I'd never been comfortable on. The family photos on the mantel, arranged so that the pictures of Eleanor were pushed to the back, barely visible behind the professional portraits from Ethan and Lauren's wedding. I made a decision in that silence. I would not call them. I would not text. I would wait and see if they thought of me at all during their 2 weeks in paradise, if it would occur to either of them to check whether the 68-year-old man they'd left behind was still breathing. 3 days passed. My phone remained silent, except for spam calls, and a reminder about a dentist appointment. No texts asking if I'd found the pasta. No quick calls to say they'd arrived safely. No photos of beaches or sunsets with cheerful captions. I had become, in their absence, exactly what Lauren had made me: invisible, optional, forgettable. But I was not idle during those 3 days. Each morning I rose early and returned to my filing cabinet, this time with purpose. I compiled evidence of my own existence, my own contributions, my own worth, measured in dollars and cents, since that seemed to be the only language this household understood. Bank statements going back 15 years, highlighted and annotated, receipts for every major purchase I'd funded, mortgage documents showing my name as cosigner, my credit score as the reason for their favorable interest rate, insurance policies, homeowners, auto, health, all carrying my name, all paid through my accounts, the country club dues, the credit card bills, the monthly transfers to cover costs Ethan's salary couldn't quite reach. Every line item was a year of my life. Every payment was a piece of myself I had given willingly, joyfully even, to people who now considered me optional. The numbers added up to more than money. They added up to decades of love translated into financial support, of sacrifice made invisible by the assumption that it would simply continue forever. On the 4th day, I retrieved Daniel Cross's business card from my wallet. I had carried it with me constantly since finding it, touching it occasionally like a talisman, reminding myself that Eleanor had left me something more than grief. She had left me a plan. I dialed the number at 9 o'clock sharp. The phone rang once, just once, before a voice answered, "Mr. Adler." Not a question, a statement of recognition. "Eleanor said you'd call eventually. I was starting to wonder if she'd been wrong about you." His voice was warm, but carried something else beneath the surface, something that sounded almost like relief, as if he had been waiting by this phone for years, as if my call had finally released him from a promise he'd grown tired of keeping. "She wasn't wrong," I said. "She never was, about anything. I just didn't listen." "No," Daniel agreed gently. "You didn't, but you're listening now, and that's what matters." He paused, and I heard papers rustling in the background. "Can you come to my office tomorrow? There are things Eleanor prepared that you need to see, things she made me promise to keep secret until this exact moment." "What kind of things?" "The kind that will change everything you think you know about your situation, Mr. Adler." His voice dropped lower, almost conspiratorial. "Your wife was a remarkable woman. She saw what was coming long before anyone else did, and she spent the last 2 years of her life making sure you would be protected when it finally arrived." I closed my eyes, and for a moment I could almost feel Eleanor beside me, her hand on my shoulder, her voice in my ear telling me it would be all right. She had known, she had prepared, and she had trusted that eventually, when the pain grew sharp enough, I would find my way to the path she had laid out for me. "Tomorrow," I said. "I'll be there." Daniel Cross's office occupied the 3rd floor of a brick building downtown, the kind of old-fashioned law practice with dark wood paneling and leather chairs that smelled of decades of confidential conversations. I arrived 15 minutes early, too anxious to wait at home any longer, and found Daniel already standing at his window watching the street below. He turned when his secretary announced me, and I saw a man in his mid-50s with gray at his temples and eyes that held the particular weariness of someone who has kept too many secrets for too long. "Mr. Adler," he said, extending his hand, "I've been waiting 3 years for this meeting. Please, sit down." He gestured to a chair across from his desk, and I noticed the stack of folders already assembled there, thick with documents and marked with colored tabs. This was not a hastily prepared consultation. This was the culmination of years of preparation, years of Eleanor planning for a day she hoped would never come. "Before we begin," Daniel said, settling into his own chair, "I need you to understand something. Everything I'm about to show you, everything Eleanor put in place, she did it because she loved you. Not because she was paranoid, not because she was controlling, because she saw something the rest of us missed, and she refused to leave you unprotected." He opened the first folder and slid a document across the desk. The header read "Revocable Living Trust with Eleanor's name," and a date from 2019, just 8 months after Ethan and Lauren's wedding. "Your wife established this trust shortly after meeting Lauren," Daniel explained. "She came to me with very specific concerns and very specific instructions. The trust contains your primary residence, several investment accounts, and all insurance policies held in both your names." He pointed to a highlighted section. "The house is held in joint tenancy with right of survivorship. When Eleanor passed, her share transferred directly to you. You currently own 70% of that property. Ethan's name is on the mortgage for credit purposes, but the deed tells a different story. I stared at the numbers, trying to reconcile them with what I had believed for years. I thought, Ethan said the house was in his name. That's what Lauren told me when they suggested I move in. They were mistaken, Daniel said, and something in his tone suggested the mistake was not accidental. There's more. Eleanor included what's called a spendthrift clause. It prevents any beneficiary's spouse from accessing trust assets without explicit approval from the trustee. He paused. You're the successor trustee, Mr. Adler. You have been since Eleanor's death. You control everything. The weight of this revelation pressed down on me. For 3 years, I had lived as a guest in my own house, deferring to Lauren's decisions, shrinking into corners to avoid inconvenience. And all along, the legal power had rested with me. Eleanor had made certain of it. Daniel reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a sealed envelope, cream-colored with roses, in the corner Eleanor's personal stationery. My name was written across the front in her familiar script, and seeing it made my throat tighten with grief I thought I had already processed. She asked me to give you this when the time came, he said softly. I'll give you a moment. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers and unfolded the letter inside. My dearest Frank, it began. If you're reading this, my worst fears came true. I'm so sorry, my love. I hoped I was wrong. I prayed I was wrong. But I watched Lauren for 2 years before I acted. And what I saw frightened me in ways I couldn't express. I saw how she isolated you from your old friends, the poker nights that stopped, the fishing trips that became inconvenient, the college buddies whose calls went unreturned. I saw how she positioned herself as the helpful one, while slowly making you dependent on her systems, her schedules, her approval. I hired someone to look into her background. What I found, Daniel will explain. I don't hate her, Frank. I pity her. Whatever made her this way must have been terrible. But I won't let her take everything we built together. I won't let her take you. You have more power than you know, my darling. Use it wisely. And remember, whatever happens, I loved you first. I loved you best, and I will love you forever. Eleanor. I read the letter twice, tears blurring the words. Eleanor's voice so clear in my mind that she might have been sitting beside me. She had seen it all. She had understood what I had been too blind or too hopeful to recognize. And instead of confronting Ethan, instead of creating a war that would have torn our family apart while she was still alive, she had quietly built a fortress around me and waited. She was thorough, Daniel said when I finally looked up. She didn't make decisions without research. The private investigator she hired was very good, very discreet. Eleanor chose not to tell Ethan what she discovered because she knew he would defend Lauren. He would resent his mother for interfering. It would have destroyed their relationship and accomplished nothing. He paused. So she protected you instead and trusted that when the time came, you would know what to do. You said she wrote 2 letters I managed. Daniel nodded. One for you, which you've just read, and one for Ethan. She left instructions that Ethan's letter should only be opened if you decide it should. That choice is yours, Mr. Adler, not mine. I sat with that for a moment, the weight of holding my son's potential awakening in my hands, the letter that might shatter his illusions or simply shatter him. Eleanor had given me that power too, trusting my judgment even from beyond the grave. The investigator, I said finally. What did Eleanor find? What was she so afraid of? Daniel's expression shifted, becoming carefully neutral in the way lawyers learn when delivering difficult news. He reached for another folder, thicker than the first, and slid it across the desk toward me. Before Ethan, he said quietly, there was another family, a widower in Florida named Robert, with adult children and substantial assets. Another elderly father-in-law who became inconvenient, another convenient tragedy. He met my eyes. Lauren isn't careless, Mr. Adler. She's practiced. And your wife figured that out while she still had time to do something about it. The folder sat between us on Daniel's desk, thick with documents and photographs, and the evidence of Lauren's previous life. I had spent 20 minutes reading through it, each page adding another layer to the portrait of the woman my son had married. Robert Whitmore, 73, widowed, father of 2 adult children, married Lauren Mitchell in 2015. Within 18 months, his relationship with his children had deteriorated beyond repair. Within 3 years, he was dead of heart failure, and his estate revised 6 months before his death went entirely to his wife. Lauren had vanished shortly after, moving north, shedding her married name, becoming someone new. "You have options," Daniel said when I finally closed the folder. "We could pursue aggressive legal action, expose Lauren's history publicly, alert authorities to the pattern, potentially build a case for fraud or undue influence. It would be messy, expensive, and very public. But it might protect others in the future." I considered this for a long moment. There was a part of me, a small, wounded part, that wanted to see Lauren destroyed, wanted to watch her carefully constructed life collapse around her, wanted Ethan to see exactly what he had chosen over his own father. But that part of me sounded too much like the villain Lauren would need me to become. "No," I said finally. "I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in truth." I met Daniel's eyes. Let them see what their life looks like without me holding it together. If I attack Lauren directly, I become the enemy. I become the bitter old man trying to destroy his son's marriage. She'll rally Ethan against me, and he'll go willingly because it's easier to hate me than to question her. Daniel nodded slowly, something like respect crossing his features. "Eleanor said you'd choose this path. She said you were never a man who fought with fists when you could fight with patience. She knew me well." "She did." He pulled out a legal pad and uncapped a pen. "So let's be systematic about this. I need you to list everything you currently provide to the household. Every payment, every service, every contribution that runs through your accounts or your name." I began to speak, and Daniel began to write. "The mortgage payment $3,400 monthly, auto-debited from my checking account. Property insurance, homeowner's insurance, health insurance, the premium plan through my former employer's retirement benefits, covering not just me but Ethan and Lauren as dependents. Auto insurance for both vehicles, both of which were titled in my name because my credit history secured better rates. All utilities, electric, gas, water, internet opened in my name years ago when Ethan's credit score couldn't qualify for service without a deposit. Lauren's supplementary credit card linked to my primary account. The streaming services, the premium cable package, the lawn service, the pest control contract. The list took 30 minutes to complete. When I finished, Daniel stared at the legal pad with an expression I couldn't quite read. "They have no idea, do they?" he said quietly. "They have no idea that their entire life runs through you." "I don't think it ever occurred to them to wonder," I replied. "That's rather the point, isn't it? I was supposed to be invisible. Invisible people don't get noticed. They just keep the machinery running." Daniel set down his pen. "So how do you want to proceed?" I had thought about this during the sleepless nights since finding Eleanor's envelope, during the silent days while Ethan and Lauren enjoyed their vacation without sparing me a single text message. I knew exactly what I wanted. "Nothing changes until day 7, I said. "Let them get comfortable. Let Lauren relax into her confidence, believing everything is exactly as she arranged it. Then we begin. Not all at once, that would be dramatic, and drama is what she'd expect from a vindictive old man. We do this systematically, legally, one withdrawal at a time, each one documented, each one within my rights as the account holder or policy owner. And when they notice, then they'll have to ask themselves a question they've been avoiding for years. What exactly did they think they were entitled to?" I stood, feeling steadier than I had in months. "I'm not stealing anything from them, Daniel. I'm simply stopping. There's no law that says I have to keep giving to people who've made it clear they don't want me around." Daniel rose as well, extending his hand. "Eleanor chose well," he said. "I'll begin drafting the necessary documents today. Everything will be ready by day 7. I shook his hand, then paused at the door. The question had been burning in my mind since he first mentioned it, and I couldn't leave without asking. "Eleanor's letter for Ethan," I said. "What did she write?" Daniel's expression shifted, becoming something softer and sadder than I had seen from him all morning. He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words with care. "She wrote what only a mother could write," he said finally. "The truth, wrapped in more love than any child probably deserves. But Mr. Adler, the question isn't what she wrote. The question is whether Ethan deserves to read it, whether he's capable of hearing what she needed to say." He paused. "That decision is yours now. Eleanor trusted you to know when the time is right, if the time ever comes at all. Maggie Lowell had been Eleanor's best friend since childhood, two girls who grew up on the same street in Vermont and somehow managed to stay connected across 6 decades of marriages, moves, and all the chaos life throws at a friendship. When Eleanor and I bought our first house, Maggie and her husband lived 3 doors down. When we moved to this neighborhood 20 years ago, Maggie followed within the year, her husband already gone to cancer by then. She and Eleanor had been inseparable until the end, and after Eleanor's death, Maggie had appointed herself my unofficial guardian, checking in weekly, bringing food I didn't ask for, making sure I hadn't simply faded away from grief. She appeared on my doorstep on day 6 of the vacation, carrying a cherry pie and wearing an expression of carefully calibrated concern. I had been coming and going at unusual hours, early morning trips to Daniel's office, afternoon visits to the bank, evenings spent organizing documents in my bedroom. Maggie noticed everything. It was both her gift and her curse. "You've been busy," she said, setting the pie on the kitchen counter and studying my face with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I've seen your car leaving before 7, coming back after dark. That's not the schedule of a man who's been left home to water plants." I poured us both coffee and gestured for her to sit. There was no point pretending with Maggie. She had known me too long, known Eleanor too well, known exactly how precarious my situation in this house had become, even when I was still denying it to myself. "You're different," she observed, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "There's something in your face I haven't seen since before Eleanor's diagnosis. You're not grieving anymore, Frank." She tilted her head, studying me. "You're planning." The word landed between us with the weight of truth. I took a long sip of coffee before responding. "They left me behind, Maggie. For Hawaii. 2 weeks in paradise, and there was no room in the budget for my ticket." I heard the bitterness in my own voice and didn't try to hide it. Lauren explained very reasonably that I wouldn't enjoy it anyway. Too old for the activities, more comfortable at home. Maggie's face hardened into an expression I recognized, the same expression Eleanor used to wear when she was furious but too dignified to raise her voice. "No room in the budget," she repeated flatly. "For the man who pays their mortgage, for the man whose credit score got them that house in the first place." She set down her mug with more force than necessary. "I've watched them for 3 years, Frank. I've done the math in my head. Ethan's salary at that marketing firm couldn't possibly cover the life they're living. The cars, the club membership, Lauren's wardrobe. I knew someone was funding it. I just kept hoping you'd see it before things went too far." "Eleanor saw it," I said quietly. "She tried to warn me. I didn't listen." "No, you didn't." Maggie's voice softened. "But she knew you wouldn't. She told me once, near the end, that this day would come. She said, 'When it happens, Maggie, remind Frank who he really is. Remind him he's not the kind of man who lies down and disappears.'" She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "So consider yourself reminded." We sat together in comfortable silence while I opened my laptop and pulled up the documents I had prepared the night before. Maggie watched without asking questions as I navigated to my insurance company's website and uploaded a formal letter requesting the removal of Lauren Adler from my premium health plan, effective in 30 days, per policy terms. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, just a policyholder exercising his right to modify his coverage. Next, I logged into my bank account and submitted a request to flag my supplementary credit card, the one Lauren carried, for review. The bank would contact the primary account holder to verify continued authorization. Standard procedure. 7 to 10 business days to process. "That's how it starts?" Maggie asked, watching the confirmation screens appear. "That's how it starts. Small steps. Everything documented, everything within my rights. By the time they notice, it will be too late to undo." My phone buzzed on the table between us. A text message from Lauren, accompanied by a photograph of a Hawaiian sunset, all gold and pink streaking across an endless ocean. The message read, "Wish you could see this. Having an amazing time. Don't forget to water the plants." Maggie leaned over to read it, her eyebrows rising. The casual cruelty of it, sharing paradise with the man they had excluded, as if he were the hired help receiving a postcard from his employers, seemed to crystallize everything that had brought us to this moment. "They really don't know what's coming, do they?" she said quietly. I looked at the sunset photo one more time, then set the phone face down on the table. "No," I said, "they don't. and by the time they figure it out, they'll finally understand exactly what they threw away. I learned later what happened in Hawaii during those crucial days, pieced together from bank notifications that arrived in my email, from Ethan's halting admissions months afterward, from the fragments Lauren let slip when she thought no one was paying attention. But in the moment, I could only sit in my quiet house and imagine the first cracks spreading through their paradise. Day 8 of the vacation. Lauren had booked herself a full spa day at the resort, hot stone massage, facial, manicure, the works. According to the bank records I would later review, she presented her credit card at the spa reception desk at 10:47 a.m. Hawaiian time. Declined. She asked the receptionist to try again, certain there must be some mistake. Declined again. The transaction logs showed 2 attempts within 30 seconds of each other, both rejected with the same code. Card flagged for review, contact primary account holder. I can picture her face in that moment, the careful mask she wears slipping just slightly before she pulled it back into place, the receptionist waiting, other guests in line behind her. The small humiliation of being unable to pay for something she had already assumed was hers by right. She excused herself to make a phone call, and according to Ethan's later account, she returned 15 minutes later with a practiced smile and an explanation ready. Fraud protection, she told him over lunch. International charges triggered some security flag. I'll sort it out when we get back. It's nothing. But it wasn't nothing, and somewhere beneath her confident exterior, she must have known that. The timing was too precise, the flag too specific. This wasn't a random security measure, this was intentional. Over the next 2 days, the cracks multiplied. The rental car company called Ethan's cell phone to report an insurance discrepancy. The policy on file, my policy, covering both vehicles registered in my name, showed a pending modification that might affect their coverage. Could Mr. Adler please confirm his insurance status? Ethan, confused and increasingly irritated, promised to look into it when they returned home. Then came the hospital bill. Lauren had gone for a routine checkup 2 weeks before the trip, using the health insurance she had always assumed would simply continue forever. The bill arrived at the hotel, forwarded from the house, stamped with words that must have sent ice through her veins. Coverage pending review. Patient may be responsible for full charges if coverage is not confirmed within 30 days. Ethan told me later that he watched Lauren handle each small crisis with a calm that struck him as strange. She didn't panic, she didn't cry or rage or fall apart the way he might have expected. Instead, she strategized. She made lists. She calculated. There was something almost professional about the way she assessed each problem and began formulating responses, as if she had navigated similar waters before and knew exactly which currents to avoid. That observation unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. His wife of 5 years suddenly seemed like someone he was meeting for the first time. He tried calling me. 3 times over 2 days, my phone rang with his number on the screen, and 3 times I let it go to voicemail. He texted twice, brief messages, asking me to call back. Nothing urgent in the wording, but something uncertain beneath the casual tone. I didn't respond to those either. For 3 years, my calls and texts had been ignored or answered with perfunctory brevity. Now, when something in their perfectly arranged world had shifted off balance, they suddenly wanted to reach me. The irony was not lost on me. I imagine Ethan staring at his phone after the 3rd unanswered call, a flicker of concern crossing his face. Not concern for my well-being. He didn't ask if I was okay, didn't wonder if something had happened to his 68-year-old father alone in an empty house. No, his concern was different. It was the concern of someone who senses that an equation they've always taken for granted has somehow changed, that a variable they never bothered to consider has suddenly become significant. The bank sent an email on day 10. I know because I received a copy as the primary account holder, notification that a communication had been sent to the supplementary cardholder regarding account status. The subject line read, "Account review, action required." Lauren read that email on the balcony of their ocean view suite, the Hawaiian sunset painting everything gold behind her. Ethan was in the shower, oblivious. She stared at her phone for a long moment, her face unreadable, processing the implications of those 3 words. Account review, action required, the language of bureaucracy that nonetheless spelled out something far more personal. Then, quietly, To herself, though Ethan would remember hearing it when he emerged from the bathroom, she said, "Old men and their games. Fine. I've played this game before." She didn't know I would eventually learn she'd said that. She didn't know those words would confirm everything Eleanor had suspected, everything Daniel's folder had documented. But I know now, and those words told me more about Lauren than 5 years of family dinners ever had. While Lauren strategized in Hawaii, I sat at the kitchen table with Daniel's complete documentation spread before me, finally seeing the full architecture of my own invisibility. The papers told a story I had lived but never truly understood, a story of string so invisible that even the puppets didn't know they were attached. The mortgage documents came first. I had known I was on the paperwork, of course, but seeing it laid out so starkly made the reality undeniable. Primary borrower: Franklin J. Adler. Co-singer: Ethan Adler. The bank had approved the loan based on my credit history, my retirement income, my 40 years of financial responsibility. Ethan's name was there for appearances, to make him feel like a homeowner, but the debt and the power had always been mine. Both vehicles in the driveway were titled to me. We had arranged it that way years ago because my insurance rates were lower, and somehow it had never been corrected. The cars Lauren drove to her tennis lessons, the SUV Ethan took to work each morning, both legally mine, loaned informally to a family that had stopped thinking of me as anything but a convenience. Every utility account bore my name. Electric, gas, water, internet all opened when Ethan and Lauren first moved in because their credit scores couldn't secure service without substantial deposits. I had meant to transfer the accounts eventually. I never had. Now I understood why Lauren had been so eager to manage the bills digitally. She hadn't wanted to organize our household. She had wanted to make sure I never looked too closely at what my name was still attached to. The insurance policies painted the same picture. Homeowners coverage through my provider. Auto insurance bundled under my account. Health insurance, the premium plan I had earned through decades of employment, covering not just me but my son and his wife as dependents. Lauren had been living under the umbrella of my benefits while treating me like a burden to be managed. She hadn't married into wealth, I realized. She had married into my generosity, and she had been so successful at making that generosity invisible that even I had forgotten it existed. Daniel arrived that afternoon with additional findings, and the folder he carried made the previous revelation seem almost quaint by comparison. "I ran a comprehensive credit check as part of our review," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "Something came up that you need to see." He spread 3 credit card statements across the table. Different banks, different account numbers, but all sharing one thing in common. They were opened in Ethan's name, Ethan's social security number, Ethan's signature, or what passed for it. "These accounts were opened over the past 2 years, Daniel explained. "Your son doesn't know they exist. I confirmed that through some discreet inquiries. The billing address isn't your house, it's a P.O. box that Lauren opened separately, using her maiden name." I stared at the statements, watching the numbers swim before my eyes. The combined balance across all 3 cards, $47,000. The spending pattern was unmistakable: luxury items, spa treatments, designer goods, jewelry, things that had nothing to do with household expenses or family needs. Lauren had been living a secret financial life, funding it with debt attached to my son's name, hiding the evidence in a post office box he didn't know existed. "She's not just spending your son's future," Daniel said quietly. "She's doing it in secret. This is fraud, Mr. Adler. She forged his signature, used his identity without consent. When these bills come due, and they will, Ethan will be responsible for debt he never authorized." I thought of my son, oblivious in Hawaii, worried about credit card flags and insurance discrepancies, while $47,000 of hidden debt accumulated in his name. Whatever anger I felt toward Ethan for his years of neglect, I couldn't let Lauren destroy him financially without his knowledge. He had made poor choices in love, but he didn't deserve to have his credit ruined by a woman who had been playing a longer game than any of us understood. "What do we do?" I asked. "For now, we document everything. When the time is right, Ethan will need to see these statements. But that's a separate battle." Daniel gathered the papers. "Today, we focus on your withdrawal." The rest of that afternoon, I made quiet moves. I contacted my bank and arranged for my share of the mortgage payment to be redirected to an escrow account, legal, documented, but flagged by the bank as a significant change requiring the other party's attention. I sent formal here to the Department of Motor Vehicles requesting the return of both vehicles registered in my name, giving 30 days notice as required by law. I notified each utility company of my intent to close the accounts, triggering requirements for new service applications in the homeowner's actual name. I wasn't destroying their life. I wasn't stealing anything or sabotaging their finances out of spite. I was simply handing their life back to them, the life they had been living on my foundation without ever acknowledging the ground beneath their feet. That evening, I sat at the kitchen counter with a notepad and pen. I had been composing this message in my head for days, trying to find words that captured everything I felt without descending into bitterness or recrimination. In the end, simplicity served better than eloquence. I wrote one line: "You didn't kick me out of your life, Lauren. You kicked yourself out of mine, and everything you thought was yours was always mine to give." I read it twice, then folded the paper carefully and slid it into an envelope. I wrote Lauren on the front in my clearest handwriting and placed it on the kitchen counter where she would find it when they returned. Then I went to my room and began to pack. The night before they returned, I finished packing the last of my belongings. It didn't take as long as I expected. 3 years of living in that house, and everything that truly mattered to me fit into 4 boxes and 2 suitcases. My books, the ones Eleanor and I had collected over decades of marriage, the photographs of our life together, which had been gradually pushed to the back of every shelf and mantel, my favorite reading chair, the leather worn soft from years of use, which I arranged to have moved to my new apartment by a company that specialized in discreet relocations. The rest, the furniture I'd helped pay for, the kitchen appliances, the television I never watched, could stay. They had never really been mine anyway. Maggie helped me load the boxes into my car at midnight when the neighbors were asleep and no one would see. She didn't ask questions. She simply carried what I handed her and squeezed my arm when the last box was secured. "Eleanor would be proud of you," she said. "Eleanor would tell me I should have done this years ago." "That too." She smiled, but her eyes were serious. "You know where to find me when you're ready." I drove to my new apartment, a modest 2-bedroom near the waterfront, the kind of place Eleanor and I had always talked about retiring to, and I didn't look back. What happened next, I learned in fragments over the following weeks. From Daniel, who tracked the legal developments with professional interest. From Maggie, who watched from her window across the street. From Ethan himself, in the painful conversations that would eventually follow. I've reconstructed their return as faithfully as I can, though I suspect the reality was even more chaotic than my imagination allows. The vacation ended 3 days early. Between the credit card complications, the insurance discrepancy, a rowing knot of anxiety that Lauren couldn't quite explain away, she insisted they needed to return home and sort things out. Ethan agreed, though he told himself it was just administrative hassle, just paperwork that had gotten tangled while they were away. On the flight back, Lauren was unusually quiet. She stared at her phone for hours, scrolling through bank statements and email notifications, her lips moving slightly as she calculated figures only she could see. Ethan tried twice to engage her in conversation. Both times, she answered in monosyllables and returned to her screen. They landed at 11 in the morning and took a taxi from the airport, too tired and too tense for the usual small talk with drivers. The house looked exactly as they had left it when the cab pulled into the driveway. Same manicured lawn, same cheerful exterior, same impression of suburban success. It wasn't until Lauren unlocked the front door that the wrongness hit them. Everything was technically intact. The furniture stood in its proper places. The walls held their familiar art. The electricity worked when Lauren flipped the switch, flooding the foyer with light. But something fundamental had changed, something that took a moment to identify. The house felt hollow in a way it hadn't before, like a movie set after the production has wrapped all surfaces and no substance. Lauren found the first notice on the kitchen counter, a letter from the electric company, formally addressed to me, informing the account holder that service would terminate in 30 days unless a new application was submitted by the property's residents. Beside it, similar notices from the gas company, the water department, the internet provider, each one polite, each one official, each one making clear that the invisible infrastructure of their daily life was about to disappear. The refrigerator was nearly empty. I had cleaned it before I left, disposing of anything that might spoil, leaving only condiments and a few items that would keep. The pantry was similarly bare. The coffee maker, my coffee maker, purchased years before Ethan and Lauren moved in, was gone from its usual spot on the counter. Ethan walked through the house in growing disbelief, cataloging absences. My books vanished from the living room shelves. The photographs of Eleanor and me removed from every surface. My reading chair, leaving a visible impression in the carpet where it had sat for 3 years. My bedroom, the small room at the back that used to be his childhood bedroom, stripped to bare walls and empty closet. I had taken nothing that wasn't mine. I had simply taken what was mine, and the gaps left behind revealed how much of that house had actually belonged to me. "Dad?" Ethan called out, though he must have already known there would be no answer. "Dad, are you here?" Silence. The particular silence of a house that has lost one of its inhabitants. Lauren found the envelope on the kitchen counter, positioned precisely where she couldn't miss it. Ethan and Lauren written on the front in my careful handwriting. She tore it open and pulled out the typed letter inside, scanning the contents with increasing pallor. The letter was not angry. I had made certain of that, revising it multiple times until every trace of bitterness had been excised. It was simply factual. A list organized by year of every financial contribution I had made to their household over 15 years. The college loan payments, the down payment on the house, the mortgage payments month after month after month, the insurance premiums, the car financing, the renovation costs, the utilities, the membership fees. Every sacrifice, every payment, every piece of my life I had converted into money and handed to them without expectation of return. The final paragraph read, "I don't expect gratitude. I never did. I gave what I gave because I loved my son and wanted him to be happy. But I think you deserve to see, at least once, what you've been standing on all these years. The foundation is being removed now. You'll need to stand on your own." Lauren crumpled the letter in her fist. "Where is he?" Ethan grabbed his phone, dialing my number with shaking fingers. The call didn't ring, just 3 tones and a recorded message. "The number you have reached has been disconnected or is no longer in service." He tried Maggie next. Ring after ring, no answer. She was home, I learned later, watching from her window, deliberately letting the phone go to voicemail. Ethan turned to Lauren, and for perhaps the first time in their marriage, he looked genuinely lost. "What do we do?" Lauren's jaw tightened. The panic that had flickered across her features moments before was already being replaced by something harder, something more calculated. She had been here before, I reminded myself. Different circumstances, different target, but the same essential challenge, a situation spinning out of her control that needed to be wrestled back into submission. "We call a lawyer," she said. What happened in that house over the following days, I learned much later from Ethan himself. He told me during one of our quiet conversations after everything had settled, his voice carrying the weight of someone confessing sins he was still learning to name. I share it now, not to excuse my son, but to explain how the blinders finally began to fall from his eyes. The lawyer Lauren called offered little comfort. Without evidence of fraud or coercion, there was nothing illegal about a man withdrawing his own financial support. The accounts were in my name. The assets were mine to control. Lauren had no legal standing to demand their continuation, no matter how loudly she insisted that family obligation should count for something. The lawyer suggested mediation. Lauren hung up on him. That first night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He wandered through the house that suddenly felt foreign, running his hands along walls he had stopped seeing years ago, and eventually found himself in the small room at the back, his childhood bedroom. Converted into a home office, Lauren had redesigned with sleek furniture and motivational art he had never chosen. My absence was most visible there. The closet stood empty. The bookshelf that had held my engineering manuals and Eleanor's beloved novels was bare. Even the faint smell of my aftershave had dissipated, replaced by the neutral scent of vacancy. He sat at the desk and unfolded my letter, smoothing the creases where Lauren had crumpled it. He read it again, slowly this time, letting each line sink in. Then he opened his laptop and began to do something he had never done before in his adult life. He calculated. The mortgage payment on their house was $3,400 per month. Ethan's take-home salary from the marketing firm was approximately $7,200. The mortgage alone consumed nearly half of everything he earned. Add the property taxes, the homeowner's insurance, the car payments, the utilities, Lauren's country club membership, the premium cable package, the lawn service, the grocery bills, The credit card minimums, the numbers didn't work. They had never worked. The math was impossible, and yet their life had continued month after month, year after year, as if sustained by some invisible force. That force, Ethan finally understood, had been me. He had never questioned how they afforded Lauren's taste because he had never had to. The life they lived had simply existed, like weather or gravity, requiring no explanation. Now, staring at a spreadsheet that showed expenses exceeding income by nearly $3,000 every month, he understood that gravity had a source, and that source had just walked away. From the kitchen, he heard Lauren's voice, sharp, insistent, nothing like the measured tones she used in public. She was on the phone with the bank again, the third call she'd made since they'd returned. What do you mean the primary account holder has to authorize it? I'm his daughter-in-law. We live in this house together. I've been making payments from this account for 3 years. A pause. Her voice rose higher. Then let me speak to a supervisor. No, I don't have authorization, that's the problem, isn't it? I need access to hello. Hello? Ethan moved quietly to the doorway and watched. Lauren stood with her back to him, phone pressed to her ear, free hand gripping the counter so hard her knuckles had gone white. She was arguing with a recorded message, shouting at a machine that had already disconnected her. Then she turned and saw him standing there. The transformation was instantaneous. The tension in her shoulders softened, her grip on the counter relaxed. The fury in her eyes was replaced by something warmer, more vulnerable, the Lauren he thought he knew, the Lauren he had married. Just dealing with some red tape, honey, she said, her voice perfectly modulated. Your father's made a mess of things, but we'll sort it out. Go back to bed. But Ethan had seen it. The mask had slipped, just for a moment, and what he'd glimpsed beneath it was someone he didn't recognize. Someone harder, someone who calculated the way engineers calculate, measuring costs and benefits with cold precision. Lauren didn't go to bed that night. Ethan pretended to sleep while she sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and screens, working through the early morning hours. He heard her on the phone again, speaking in hushed tones, canceling subscriptions and memberships, moving money between accounts like someone rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. Her fear, he realized, wasn't poverty. They could survive on his salary alone if they made adjustments, downsized, lived within their means. What Lauren feared was something else entirely. Exposure. Her book club met next week. Her tennis partners would notice if she stopped appearing at the courts. Her Instagram followers expected a certain aesthetic, a certain lifestyle, a certain image of success that required constant maintenance. The invisible machinery that had kept that image running was failing, and Lauren was scrambling to construct temporary repairs before anyone noticed the cracks. At 2 a.m, Ethan gave up pretending. He walked to the kitchen and found Lauren hunched over a pile of statements and bills, her hair disheveled, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. She didn't hear him approach until he was standing right beside her. That was when he saw them. Credit card statements with his name printed at the top, accounts he had never opened, balances he had never incurred, addresses he didn't recognize. 3 different cards, 3 different banks. Combined debt that made his stomach lurch. Lauren. His voice came out strange, almost detached. What are these? She snatched the statements away before he could read the numbers clearly, shoving them into a pile with other papers, covering them with her hands as if hiding evidence. Nothing, she said quickly. Bank errors. Identity theft. Maybe I've been meaning to report it. Go back to sleep, Ethan. I'm handling everything. But her eyes said something different. Her eyes said she had been caught, and she was already calculating her next move, her next explanation, her next lie. Ethan stood there for a long moment, looking at the woman he had married, and felt something shift in his chest, a foundation cracking, a belief beginning to crumble. He went back to bed, but he didn't sleep. 2 weeks after I moved into my new apartment, Maggie flew to Florida. She had planned the trip months earlier, a visit to a former colleague from her teaching days who had retired to Boca Raton, and I encouraged her to go despite everything happening. Life doesn't stop for family drama, I told her. Besides, I needed time alone to settle into my new reality, to learn the rhythms of a life that belonged entirely to me for the first time in years. She called me on her 3rd day there, her voice strange and tight in a way I had never heard from her before. Frank, I need to tell you something. I don't want to do this over the phone, but I don't think it can wait until I get back. I sat down on my new couch, a modest thing I'd purchased from a second-hand store, nothing like the expensive sectional in the house I'd left, and told her I was listening. Maggie had been having lunch with her friend Patricia, catching up on the years since they'd last seen each other. The conversation wandered, as conversations between old friends do, touching on health and grandchildren, and the weather. Eventually, Maggie mentioned Eleanor's death. Patricia had met Eleanor once, years ago, and offered her condolences. This led naturally to talk of family, of how I was coping, of the son and daughter-in-law I had been living with. I mentioned Lauren's name, Maggie said. Just in passing. I said something about how difficult she'd made things for you, and Patricia went completely still. She set down her fork and stared at me like I'd said something impossible. Patricia had asked a question. Lauren Adler? Her maiden name wouldn't happen to be Mitchell, would it? Maggie confirmed that it was. She had seen the wedding invitation years ago, remembered the elegant script announcing the union of Ethan Adler and Lauren Mitchell. What Patricia told her next changed everything. Patricia's elderly mother lived in a retirement community in Boca Raton. 8 years ago, her mother's neighbor, a widower named Robert Whitmore, 73, kind, wealthy, lonely after his wife's death, had met a charming younger woman named Lauren Mitchell. They married within a year. Within 18 months, Robert's relationship with his adult children had deteriorated beyond repair. He stopped attending family gatherings, stopped returning calls, eventually changed the locks on his house, and told his daughter he needed space from her negativity. Within 3 years, Robert was dead. Heart failure, the death certificate said. His estate, revised 6 months before his death to exclude his children, entirely went to his wife, Lauren Mitchell Whitmore, who sold the house within a month, divorced herself from any connection to Robert's family, and vanished somewhere north, taking the money and leaving behind a bitterly contested will that the children couldn't afford to fight. Patricia still has the newspaper clipping, Maggie said, from when the children tried to challenge the will. There's a photo of Lauren standing outside the courthouse, looking appropriately grief-stricken. It's her, Frank. Same face, same eyes, same everything. I didn't speak for a long moment. The information settled into me like stones dropping into deep water, each one sending ripples through everything I thought I understood. Did Eleanor know all of this? Maggie's voice softened. She knew. Not all the details. She didn't have Patricia's connection, but she hired that investigator, remember. He found the marriage records, the obituary, enough to recognize the pattern. She told me about it a few months before she died. She was so angry, Frank. Not at Lauren, at herself, for not seeing it sooner, for not being able to make Ethan listen. Why didn't she tell me? Because she knew you'd want to confront it directly. You'd want to sit Ethan down and show him the evidence and trust that truth would win. But Eleanor understood something you didn't. Ethan wouldn't believe it. He'd defend Lauren. He'd accuse his mother of jealousy or manipulation. It would have torn your family apart while Eleanor was still alive, and she couldn't bear that. Maggie paused. So she protected you instead, with the trust, with Daniel, with the letters. She built you a fortress, Frank, and she trusted you to use it when the time came. I thought of Eleanor in those final years, weakened by her illness, but still working, still planning, still protecting me from threats I couldn't see. She had known she was dying. She had known she couldn't save Ethan from his choices, but she had refused to leave me defenseless. The investigator's report, I said slowly. Daniel showed me some of it, but he never mentioned how Robert died. Maggie was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was careful, measured, the way people speak when they're about to say something terrible. Heart failure. 3 months after he changed his will to make Lauren the sole beneficiary. The words hung between us, heavy with implication. Patricia's mother told her something else, Maggie continued. In those last months, Robert seemed confused sometimes, disoriented. His children thought it was age, maybe early dementia, but he'd been sharp as a tack until Lauren came along. She paused again, and I heard her take a breath. Frank, I need to ask you something. Your blood pressure medication. Who manages your prescriptions? The question hit me like a physical blow. I thought of the pill organizer Lauren had insisted on setting up for me after Eleanor's death. How helpful she'd seemed, sorting my medications into daily compartments, picking up refills from the pharmacy so I wouldn't have to bother. how she'd offered to manage my doctor's appointments, keep track of dosages, make sure I never missed a pill. I thought of the occasional dizzy spells I'd had over the past year, the moments of confusion I'd attributed to grief and age, the way my doctor had seemed puzzled at my last checkup, noting that my blood pressure was oddly variable despite consistent medication. "Lauren," I said. Lauren managed my prescriptions. The silence on the line stretched between Florida and my small apartment, filled with the weight of everything Maggie wasn't saying, everything we both now understood. Eleanor hadn't just been protecting my money. She had been protecting my life. Ethan told me later what happened in the days that followed, during one of our tentative meetings after the dust had settled. He spoke haltingly, like a man confessing to crimes he was still learning to name, and I listened without interruption. I share his account now because understanding how my son finally began to see requires knowing what he saw when he looked back at his own blindness. The memories came at night, when Lauren was asleep and the house was quiet and Ethan lay awake staring at shadows on the ceiling. They surfaced unbidden, moments he had dismissed or explained away over the years, now rearranging themselves into a pattern he could no longer ignore. He remembered his mother's unusual quietness around Lauren. Eleanor had never been confrontational, but she had always been warm, engaged, full of questions and observations. Around Lauren, she became watchful in a way Ethan had attributed to the natural awkwardness between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law. Now he wondered if it had been something else entirely, not awkwardness, but assessment. Not discomfort, but recognition. He remembered Eleanor's suggestion, made casually over coffee a few months after the wedding, that Ethan and Lauren might want to keep finances separate, just in case. He had laughed it off, told his mother she was being old-fashioned. Lauren had overheard and later commented that Eleanor seemed very focused on money for someone who claims family is what matters. Ethan had agreed. He had taken Lauren's side without hesitation, as he always did. He remembered the questions Eleanor asked in those final years, whenever they managed to visit despite Lauren's busy schedule. "Are you really happy, sweetheart?" she would ask, her eyes searching his face. "You know you can tell me anything." He had assured her everything was fine, wonderful, perfect. He had not noticed the way her expression flickered with something that might have been doubt or might have been grief. He remembered Lauren discouraging visits to his parents' house. There was always a reason, a work, conflict, a social obligation, an illness that required rest. When they did visit, Lauren would check her phone constantly, mentioning obligations that required them to leave early. Gradually, the visits became shorter, then less frequent, then rare enough that Eleanor's death caught Ethan by surprise. He had seen his mother only twice in her final 6 months. Lauren had been too busy both times to accompany him. He remembered my face at his wedding, not quite joyful, though I had smiled and toasted and played the part of proud father. There had been something else in my eyes, something complicated that Ethan had chosen not to examine. Now, lying in the dark, he understood. I had seen something. Eleanor had seen something. They had tried to warn him in their quiet ways, and he had chosen not to hear. The confrontation came 3 days after they returned from Hawaii. Ethan found the credit card statements Lauren had hidden, the ones she'd snatched away that night in the kitchen. He had searched while she was at a meeting that he now suspected was an attempt to secure alternative financing. The statements were tucked in a box in her closet, behind shoes she never wore, and the numbers made his hands shake. When Lauren returned, he was sitting at the kitchen table with the statements spread before him. "What is this?" he asked. 3 cards in my name, $47,000 in debt, accounts I never opened." Lauren's reaction cycled through familiar phases. First deflection, those were old, already resolved, nothing to worry about. Then minimization, just some household expenses that got a little out of hand. Then, when Ethan refused to accept these explanations, attack. "Your father is trying to destroy us," she snapped, "and you're interrogating me about paperwork, about credit cards? He's the one who abandoned his own family, and you're treating me like a criminal?" But Ethan didn't back down. Not this time. He pressed until the truth emerged in fragments. $47,000, accumulated over 2 years, spent on maintaining an image of success they had never actually achieved. Designer clothes, spa treatments, jewelry, the appearance of wealth to mask the reality of debt. "Someone had to make us look successful," Lauren said, her voice turning cold and hard in a way Ethan had never heard before. Your salary certainly wasn't doing it. Do you think my friends would have accepted us if they knew we were barely scraping by? Do you think we'd have been invited to the club, to the parties, to any of it? For the first time in their marriage, Ethan did not apologize. He did not smooth things over or seek peace at any price. He slept in the guest room that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering when he had become someone who chose comfort over courage, convenience over truth. The next morning, he called in sick to work. He drove past the house where I had lived, but of course I wasn't there. He sat in his car outside Maggie's house for 20 minutes, working up the nerve to knock. But in the end, he drove away. He wasn't ready yet. He didn't know what he would say. That evening, Lauren found him in the kitchen, staring at nothing. "Your father has to have money somewhere," she said, her tone businesslike now, as if discussing a problem to be solved. "Call him, apologize, say whatever you have to say. Get us back in." Ethan looked at his wife, really looked, perhaps for the first time since their wedding day. "And if I don't want to?" Lauren's expression shifted, the warmth she could perform so convincingly replaced by something that had always been there underneath, something cold and calculating and utterly practical. "Then you need to decide whose side you're on." It took Ethan a week to find me. He called Daniel Cross's office repeatedly until the receptionist, perhaps out of pity or perhaps just exhaustion, confirmed that yes, Mr. Adler was a client, and yes, she could pass along a message. I received that message on a Tuesday morning, a simple note saying my son wanted to meet, along with his phone number, as if I might have forgotten it. I called him back that afternoon. The conversation was brief, awkward. Two people who had once known each other intimately, now speaking like strangers negotiating the terms of a business arrangement. I gave him my address. He said he would come the next day. My apartment was nothing like the house I had left behind. 2 bedrooms in a modest building near the waterfront, the kind of place Eleanor and I had talked about retiring to someday, close enough to hear the boats in the harbor, small enough to maintain without help, quiet enough for reading and thinking and being alone with memories. I had filled it with my books, arranged Eleanor's photographs on every available surface, made it into a space that finally felt like mine. When the knock came, I was ready. I had been ready for days, rehearsing conversations in my head, trying to prepare for whatever version of my son might appear at my door. I opened it to find Ethan standing in the hallway, looking older than I remembered, worn in ways that had nothing to do with the weeks that had passed. "I wondered when you'd come," I said, stepping aside to let him enter. He walked into my apartment slowly, taking in the modest furniture, the walls lined with books, the photographs of his mother smiling from every corner. I watched him absorb the reality of my new life, smaller than what he'd known, simpler, but entirely my own. "It's nice," he said finally, though his voice suggested he found it anything but. This was not the lifestyle he had imagined for his father. This was not the comfortable invisibility he had grown accustomed to providing. "It's enough," I replied. "Sit down, Ethan. Say what you came to say." He sat on the edge of my second-hand couch, hands clasped between his knees, and for a long moment he simply stared at the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked on the first word. "Dad, I'm sorry." The apology came out in fragments, halting and imperfect, the words of a man who had never learned the language of accountability. He listed his failures one by one, the birthdays he had forgotten, the visits he had canceled, the phone calls he had cut short, the silence he had maintained when Lauren spoke to me with casual cruelty, the way he had watched me shrink into the corners of my own house and done nothing to stop it. I listened without interrupting. I had learned patience in the weeks since leaving, had discovered that silence could be a gift you give someone who needs space to hear their own voice. Ethan talked for nearly 15 minutes, circling around his guilt, approaching it and retreating from it, building towards something that might have been genuine remorse or might have been performance. I couldn't tell anymore. I had lost the ability to read my son clearly, if I had ever truly possessed it. When he finally ran out of words, the apartment fell quiet. I could hear the distant sound of boats in the harbor, the cry of gulls, the mundane music of a world that continued regardless of our small family tragedy. "I don't need an apology, son," I said at last. He looked up, confusion flickering across his features. This was not the response he had expected. He had come prepared for anger, perhaps, or for tearful reconciliation. He had not prepared for this. "What I need," I continued, "is to know if you understand what you chose. An apology is just words. Anyone can say they're sorry. Understanding requires something more. It requires you to look at the last 15 years and see clearly what happened, not just what you did, but why you did it. Not just the harm you caused, but the harm you allowed. The distinction cut deep. I watched it land. Watched Ethan's face shift as he grasped the difference between regret and comprehension. "I'm trying to understand," he said quietly. "That's a start. But trying isn't the same as succeeding." I leaned forward in my chair, holding his gaze. "I need you to hear something, Ethan, and I need you to really hear it. I will not return to the old arrangement. I will not move back into that house. I will not resume paying bills and mortgages and insurance premiums for people who treated me like an inconvenience. I will not rescue you from the consequences of your choices, whatever those consequences turn out to be." "Dad, I'm not finished." My voice was firm but not angry. I had moved past anger weeks ago. What remained was something clearer, harder, more durable. I will not pretend that the last 15 years of dismissal and diminishment didn't happen. I won't erase that history to make you comfortable. I love you, Ethan. I always will. You're my son, and nothing will change that. But love doesn't mean I have to be convenient for you. Love doesn't mean I have to disappear into the background of your life so you don't have to feel guilty about ignoring me." Ethan's eyes were wet. Whether from genuine emotion or from the shock of hearing his father speak with such unflinching clarity, I couldn't say. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I want you to become someone worth reconciling with. I want you to do the hard work of understanding, not apologizing, understanding what you allowed to happen. I want you to figure out who you are when you're not choosing the path of least resistance." I paused. "I want you to become the man your mother believed you could be." He stood slowly, understanding that our conversation had reached its end. No promises had been exchanged, no reconciliation completed, just truth, spoken plainly, left to do whatever work it might do. As he reached the door, I stopped him. "Ethan, your mother wrote you a letter before she died. She gave it to Daniel with instructions I could decide when you were ready to read it." He turned, his face pale. "A letter? She wrote it in her final months. She wanted you to have it, but only when the time was right." I held his gaze. "I think it's time. Daniel will give it to you." Ethan's hand trembled on the doorknob. "What does it say?" "That's between you and your mother." I paused, feeling the weight of what I was about to say. "But Ethan, whatever that letter says, whatever truth she left for you, you'll have to carry it. No one else can carry it for you. Not me, not Lauren, just you." He nodded once, unable to speak, and left without another word. Ethan went to Daniel's office the following morning. I wasn't there. I had chosen not to be, feeling that whatever passed between my son and his mother's final words should happen without my presence complicating it. But Daniel told me afterward what occurred, and Ethan himself confirmed it during our later conversations, his voice hollow with the weight of what he had learned. The letter was in Eleanor's handwriting, 3 pages of cream-colored stationery covered in her elegant script. Daniel handed it to Ethan in a sealed envelope and left the room to give him privacy. What followed was between a son and the mother he had lost, words reaching across the divide of death to deliver truths that could no longer be softened or evaded. "My dearest son," Eleanor had written, "if you're reading this, then what I feared most has come to pass. You chose her over your father, just as I worried you might. I don't write this to punish you, Ethan. I write because I love you too much to let you live in ignorance, even if the truth causes you pain. I had Lauren investigated before your wedding. I know that sounds terrible, a mother spying on her son's fiancé, but I saw things that worried me, patterns I recognized from my years of watching people. I found another marriage, Ethan, another elderly man, wealthy and lonely, who died conveniently after changing his will. Another family torn apart by a woman who knew exactly how to position herself. I begged you to wait. Do you remember? I asked you to give it another year, to be certain. You called me paranoid. You said I was jealous, that I couldn't accept you had found happiness. I couldn't force you to see what I saw. No mother can force her child to see what he doesn't want to see. So I protected your father instead. I built safeguards he didn't know about, trusts and provisions and legal structures that would keep him safe if my worst fears came true. And I prayed I was wrong. Every day, I prayed I was wrong about her. I wasn't wrong, Ethan, but you can still choose differently. Not for me, I'll be gone by the time you read this. Not even for your father, though he deserves so much better than what you've given him. Choose differently for yourself, for who you want to become. You were a good boy once. You can be a good man still, but only if you're brave enough to see the truth and act on it. I love you, my son. I always will. Mom. Ethan emerged from Daniel's office 45 minutes later, his face ravaged by tears he hadn't bothered to hide. He didn't speak to anyone. He simply walked to his car and drove away, carrying the weight of his mother's words like stones in his chest. The mediation happened 3 days later. Lauren had retained an attorney, a sharp woman from a downtown firm who specialized in family disputes, and requested a formal meeting to discuss financial arrangements. I agreed to attend, though Daniel warned me it would likely be unpleasant. I wanted to see it through. I wanted to watch Lauren's careful construction collapse. The conference room was bland and professional, the kind of neutral space designed for difficult conversations. Lauren sat across from me, flanked by her attorney, wearing an expression of wounded dignity that I might once have found convincing. Ethan was not present. He had refused to come. Lauren's attorney opened with a proposal. Given the family relationship and the reasonable expectations Lauren had developed over years of marriage, perhaps some transitional financial support could be arranged. A monthly stipend, continued health insurance, something to ease the adjustment. Daniel let her finish, then opened his briefcase. Before we discuss any arrangements, he said calmly, there are some matters my client believes should be on the record. He laid out the evidence systematically. The previous marriage to Robert Whitmore, the contested will, the hidden credit cards in Ethan's name, the pattern of isolation, the systematic separation of elderly men from their families and their assets. Each document landed on the table like a stone, building a wall of truth that Lauren's careful fictions could not climb. Her attorney's face grew increasingly troubled. Perhaps we should take a break, she suggested. There's one more thing, Daniel said. He produced a final document, a written statement from Robert Whitmore's daughter in Florida, obtained through Maggie's connection. Miss Whitmore has provided testimony about her father's final months. She notes that Lauren Whitmore had taken over managing Robert's medications. She describes her father mentioning, weeks before his death, how helpful his wife had been with his pills. The implication needed no elaboration. It hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Lauren's face drained of color. For one moment, the mask she had worn for years, the charming wife, the caring daughter-in-law, the reasonable woman caught in unfortunate circumstances, disappeared completely. What remained underneath was something I had never seen clearly before. Calculation. Pure, cold, mechanical calculation, assessing options and angles even now. Her attorney leaned over and whispered urgently. Lauren shook her head. You have no legal claim to Mr. Adler's assets, Daniel said quietly. You never did. This mediation is over. Lauren stood abruptly, knocking her chair backward. She looked at me across the table, and in her eyes I saw not defeat but recalibration. A predator recognizing that this particular hunt had failed, already considering where to move next. This isn't over, she said, but even she knew it was. The collapse happened faster than anyone expected. I watched it unfold from the quiet distance of my waterfront apartment, piecing together events from Daniel's updates and Maggie's observations, and eventually from Ethan himself when he finally found the courage to tell me what those final weeks had been like. Word spread through Lauren's carefully curated social circle with the speed of whispered scandal. I never said a word to anyone that wasn't my way. And besides, I had no connections to the world Lauren had built. But mediation proceedings generate paperwork, and paperwork becomes public record, and public records have a way of finding interested eyes. Someone talked. Someone always talks. Lauren's book club met without her. Her tennis partners stopped returning texts. The invitations that had once filled her calendar dried up, replaced by the particular silence of people who have decided someone is no longer worth knowing. The country club sent a formal letter. Her membership, which had been paid through my account, had lapsed, and after careful consideration, the board had decided not to accept her personal application for reinstatement. No explanation was offered. None was needed. Her Instagram perfect life, the carefully staged photos, the humble brags, the curated image of success became a prison of performance with no audience left to applaud. She kept posting for a while, Ethan told me. Photos of meals no one commented on, updates no one liked, a woman shouting into a void that had stopped listening. The financial reality was even more brutal. Without my support, the house I had helped pay for entered foreclosure proceedings. The bank sent notices, then warnings, then final demands. The cars both titled in my name were returned when I formally requested them. The hidden credit card debt Lauren had accumulated went to collection agencies, their calls filling the answering machine with increasingly urgent demands. Ethan's salary alone could not sustain the life Lauren had constructed, could not maintain the illusion she had worked so hard to build. She suggested they start fresh somewhere new, a different city, a different state, somewhere no one knew their history. Ethan told me later how she had framed it an adventure, a chance to reinvent themselves, an opportunity to leave behind all this unpleasantness and begin again. But Ethan had read his mother's letter by then. He had seen Daniel's files. He understood what starting fresh meant to Lauren. It meant new territory, new targets. Another elderly widower with assets to plunder, another family to infiltrate and destroy. The pattern would continue, the predator would hunt again, and Ethan would be complicit in whatever came next. He told her in their bedroom, surrounded by the boxes they had begun packing for a move that would never happen. His voice was steady, he said, though his hands shook. "I'm filing for divorce." Lauren cycled through her tactics with the practiced ease of someone who had navigated such moments before. First came tears, the wounded wife, betrayed by a husband who had chosen his father over their marriage. Then accusations this was all my fault. I had poisoned Ethan against her. I had destroyed their happiness out of spite. Then promises she would change. They would go to counseling. Things would be different. Finally, threats she would ruin him, take everything, make sure he regretted this for the rest of his life. None of it worked. Not because Ethan had suddenly become strong, but because he finally understood. His weakness, his years of silence, his willingness to look away, his choice of comfort over courage had made him complicit in everything Lauren had done to me. The only way to stop the pattern was to break it. The only way to become someone different was to act differently. "I'm not choosing my father over you," he told her. "I'm choosing to stop being the person who lets this happen." Lauren left with 2 suitcases and the cold smile of someone already calculating her next move. At the door, she turned back one final time. "You think this is over? Your father won. But what did he win? An empty apartment and a son who'll never forgive himself. Some victory." The door closed behind her. Ethan stood alone in the house that would soon belong to the bank, surrounded by the wreckage of a life built on sand. The weight of everything he had allowed, every silence, every dismissal, every moment he had chosen convenience over conscience, settled onto his shoulders like a physical burden. Lauren was wrong about one thing. I hadn't won anything. There are no winners in a story like this. There is only survival, and the slow, painful work of rebuilding what was broken. 6 months passed. Spring turned to summer. Summer faded into autumn, and the world continued its indifferent rotation while the wreckage of my family slowly settled into new configurations. I watched the seasons change from my waterfront apartment, learning the rhythms of a life that belonged entirely to me for the first time in longer than I could remember. My days found their own shape, unhurried and undemanding. I volunteered at the local library 3 mornings a week, teaching computer skills to seniors who reminded me of myself, people who had been left behind by a world moving too fast, who needed someone patient enough to explain things without condescension. I discovered I was good at it. 40 years of engineering had taught me how to break complex problems into simple steps, and there was satisfaction in watching someone's face light up when they finally understood how to send an email to their grandchildren or video chat with a friend across the country. I had dinner with Maggie twice a week. We cooked together sometimes, trading recipes Eleanor had left behind, or we ordered takeout and ate on my small balcony watching the boats come and go. We talked about everything and nothing, old memories, current events, the small observations that fill a life when you stop rushing through it. She never asked about Ethan or Lauren. She didn't need to. She understood that some subjects required silence more than words. I read the books Eleanor had always wanted me to read, the ones I had put off for decades claiming I was too busy. Novels she had loved, poetry collections she had marked with her careful annotations, histories and biographies she had pressed into my hands during our 40 years together. Reading them felt like conversations with her, like she was sitting beside me, turning the pages, waiting to discuss what I thought. My life was smaller than before. The apartment had 2 rooms instead of 10. My social circle had contracted to a handful of genuine connections instead of a house full of people who didn't see me. My finances were modest, my ambitions limited to getting through each day with purpose and dignity. But for the first time in years, my life was infinitely, completely my own. I didn't celebrate Lauren's downfall. I didn't follow her movements or take satisfaction in her losses. She had disappeared somewhere, another state, another hunting ground, another chapter in a story I no longer needed to read. I hoped, in some distant way, that she might find help, might break her own patterns, might become someone different. But that was her journey, not mine. I didn't follow Ethan's divorce proceedings either. Daniel kept me informed of the basics: the house sold at a loss, the debts settled, the legal dissolution of a marriage that had been hollow long before the paperwork made it official. But I didn't seek details. I didn't need to know. What I knew was this: Ethan had taken a smaller apartment across town. He hadn't asked me for help, not once, and I respected him for that, even as part of me ached to make things easier for him. He had started therapy, Maggie told me. He was doing the work of understanding himself, excavating the foundations of his choices, learning to see clearly what he had spent years refusing to look at. He wrote me letters. The first few he didn't send, I learned about them later, drafts crumpled and discarded, attempts at communication that didn't survive his own uncertainty. Then the letters started arriving, once a week, handwritten on plain paper. They weren't apologies, not exactly. They were attempts at understanding. He wrote about memories he was re-examining, moments he now saw differently, the slow, painful process of rebuilding his relationship with himself. I read every one. I didn't always reply, but I read them. We met for coffee on a Saturday in October, 6 months, almost to the day since I had walked out of the house I'd paid for. It wasn't reconciliation, neither of us pretended it was. It was contact, a thread maintained across a distance that might or might not eventually close. We talked about Eleanor, about the weather, about the books I was reading and the therapy he was doing and the small observations that fill an hour when 2 people are relearning how to be in each other's presence. We didn't talk about Lauren. We didn't talk about money or blame or the years of silence that had brought us here. As we stood to leave, Ethan asked a question I could tell he had been carrying for months. "Do you think Mom would be proud of me for finally seeing?" I considered the question carefully. Eleanor deserved a careful answer. "I think she would say it's not about making her proud," I said at last. "It's about making yourself someone worth being, someone you can look at in the mirror without flinching. She believed you could be that person, Ethan. The question is whether you believe it." He nodded slowly, absorbing this. We parted without embracing, without promises, without the false comfort of pretending everything was healed. Some wounds take years to close, some never close completely, but they can become scars, and scars tell stories, and stories are how we make sense of the lives we've lived. I walked home along the waterfront as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The light turned golden, then amber, then the deep orange of autumn evenings. I passed a bench where Eleanor and I used to sit, watching the boats and talking about someday we'd travel, someday we'd retire, someday we'd have time for all the things we kept postponing. I didn't stop. The grief was there, would always be there, but it was no longer a wound. It was a scar that told the story of a love that had shaped me, protected me, and ultimately set me free. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Maggie. "Don't forget dinner tomorrow. I'm making Eleanor's pot roast." I smiled. I kept walking. Behind me, the shadows lengthened across the water, but I moved toward the light, not triumphant, not vindicated, just free. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't what you take back. It's what you finally refuse to give. And so ends the story of Franklin Adler, a man who spent 15 years giving everything to a family that had stopped seeing him, only to discover that the greatest act of love is sometimes walking away. Frank didn't seek revenge through anger or destruction. He simply stopped giving pieces of himself to people who had forgotten his worth. He reclaimed his dignity, his peace, and his life. This story reminds us that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, and silence should never be taken for granted. The people who give the most are often the ones who ask for the least in return. But even the most patient heart has limits. Even the quietest person deserves to be seen. If Frank's journey resonated with you, if you saw pieces of yourself or someone you love in his story, I hope you'll carry this truth with you. It is never too late to choose yourself. It is never too late to set boundaries. And it is never too late to stop giving your light to those who only see darkness. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. Your time and attention mean more than you know. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below telling me what moment affected you most. Did Frank make the right choice? What would you have done in his place? I read every single comment, and your thoughts help shape the stories I tell. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story, and I will see you in the next one. Until then, remember, your worth is not measured by what you give, but by how you are valued in return.